Okay, so it should now be recording.
Okay, so should I get going?
Please.
Okay, great. Okay, so I wanted to talk about this idea. Yeah, and thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Wanted to talk about this idea of the epistemic commons, which I kind of developed in this book, Why It's Okay to Speak Your Mind. And this book is more about, I mean, it's really about kind of social epistemology and kind of thinking through the implications of the fact that our epistemic lives are very interconnected. So we're not, in the epistemic sense, we're not like leopards who kind of do their own thing. We're very much kind of social creatures, and we rely on others for much of what we know. What are the implications of that for what we can know and what we can be justified in believing? Okay, so let me just kind of so what I want to kind of just go through some of the themes I talk about here, and just kind of talk about the epistemic commons and see what people think about the idea and the objection. So okay, so to get into the reason why maybe this is important, or this idea of speaking your mind. And in the book, I kind of develop more kind of focused and thinking about revealing our evidence. So that's the kind of sense of speaking our minds that I have in mind, not just kind of blurting out insults or whatever, but kind of revealing evidence or giving arguments. And there's been a lot of op-eds about this, but this kind of can get us thinking about why this issue is important. So there's certainly a lot of people today that report not feeling free to speak their minds, especially about topics that may be controversial. And interestingly, this figure is really about 3 times higher than, and they asked this very question in the 50s during McCarthyism, and the figure is actually 3 times higher now. So that's a kind of cause for worry, maybe. And more educated people feel more pressure to self-censor. So this is an interesting pattern as well. So going, and every level of education, people feel more. So the PhDs feel the most pressure, and maybe the high school graduates feel the least pressure. Okay, so you might think, like, one kind of skeptical response here might be like, well, what's the big deal? Why should we care so much about whether people speak their minds? I mean, there's lots of problems in the world. I mean, there's a problem of global poverty or climate change, which are, of course, extremely important problems. But it might seem like, well, people speaking their minds, maybe that should be like number 437 in our priorities. After all these important issues. So that's another form of kind of skepticism. And you might think, look, maybe it's a sign of progress that people kind of check themselves rather than say whatever they're thinking. And there are so many other pressing problems in the world. So this is a kind of way of thinking, well, yeah, that data is there, but it's not that big of a deal. Okay, so the core idea of the book is, look, this problem is almost a meta problem. So whatever kind of first order problems we want to solve, climate change, maybe AI risk or poverty, these are all we might think of as first order problems. They're certain issues that we have, and we want to find out the best policies that can solve them. This is almost a meta problem because I argue that without people kind of feeling free to speak their minds in a certain way, our picture of the world is going to be compromised. So it's going to have certain blind spots. And if you don't know what the world is like, then whatever steps you take to improve things may backfire, right? So one example of this is the Chernobyl disaster in modern day Ukraine. So that disaster is interesting because the the effects of the disaster are that there was a nuclear meltdown, and people to this day have suffer from the consequences of it. So people got radiation poisoning. And what's interesting about this very tragic incident is that it wasn't like, they didn't have enough trucks to move people out, or buses or whatnot. So it wasn't like a logistical issue. It wasn't like, okay, well, there's a plant that's gone down. We just don't have enough resources to get people out. We're going to do the best we can. It wasn't that kind of a problem. Rather, the problem was it wasn't known that there was a nuclear meltdown for a long time. And by the time it was known, it was kind of too late. And the reason it wasn't known is that there wasn't a free sharing of information. So people throughout the kind of supply chain of information had an incentive to downplay what was happening. So they didn't have the right incentives, basically. They didn't have the incentive to share what they knew. They had an incentive to say, because this was an authoritarian government at the time, had an incentive to say, oh, it's a minor problem, we'll fix it, because you don't want to get flack from the people at the top. So there was an incentive to not share the whole picture. But you compound this, and then the upper command doesn't know like what's going on, and then even if they have the best of intentions, they're kind of hamstrung by this. So some people have also applied this to the Bay of Pigs fiasco, where the big part of the problem was it was just the people who were making the decision didn't really have an accurate picture of what was going to happen. Another thing that people have kind of noted in this vein is that one major advantage that the Allies had over the Axis powers, militarily they were perhaps somewhat evenly matched, but one major advantage that the Allies had was that there was much more free sharing of information. So the upper command had a better idea of what was actually happening. Again, within the Axis powers, there was this incentive to say the war effort was more successful than it actually was. Okay, so these are just a couple of things by way of illustration, and broader lesson is, look, without an accurate picture of the world, whatever we want to solve, be it poverty or inflation or whatever it is we want to solve, can backfire. Now, democracies are typically better than authoritarian regimes at this, but they're not immune to problems, and so insofar as we see these problems, we should maybe try to see what we can do about them. Okay, and the reason is, and this is the kind of epistemic commons idea, is, and there's a great book on this, The Knowledge Illusion, where they kind of look at all the evidence over the last few decades in cognitive science and psychology, and argue for this idea in the subtitle, basically, we never think alone. So we're social creatures. Not just our facts, but like the way we look at the world, our perspectives, our value systems, it's all kind of deeply influenced by the culture we live in, the social situation we live in. And so we're again, go back to the leopard metaphor. We're not like leopards doing our own thing. We're more like, I don't know, maybe lions or hyenas or whatever. We're very social creatures. And one simple way to just put it is, look, we can't verify everything by ourselves. So, I believe there's a planet called Jupiter. I've never seen it. I just kind of take, this is the kind of knowledge by testimony and so on. Okay, so we must rely on a kind of collectively maintained stock of facts. And Sloman and Furtenbach kind of put one interesting quote from their book is, they say, language, memory, attention, indeed all mental functions can be thought of as operating in a way that's distributed across a community according to a division of cognitive labor. So there's a division of physical labor, and this Adam Smith famously talked about this, but it's not just physical labor. There's also cognitive labor. So we're all, we all kind of specialize in various fields, and we can only independently verify a small slice of the things we know. Here's an example from the psychology literature. So people are asked, do you know how a zipper works? And most people think, okay, well, zipper is a very simple object. I use it every day. Of course, I know how it works. And then they're asked, okay, actually draw it out, draw out the mechanism. Okay, and then they're given that exercise, and then afterwards they're asked again, okay, how well do you think you know how a zipper works now? And they reduce their confidence quite a bit. Basically, they realize they don't know exactly how it works. Similar with bicycles. So one metaphor here is, look, our map of the world is kind of coarsely pixelated, and to zoom in, we have to rely on others. And in the case of zippers, you know, you might think, look, the reason people think they know how zipper works is, look, if they really wanted to figure it out, they could, you know, use Wikipedia, so or whatever, the knowledge is at their fingertips. Okay, so here's this idea of an epistemic commons. I think, you know, just as there's a physical commons, you know, oceans, atmosphere, there's also an epistemic commons. And when you have a kind of broadly common resource like this, it pays to look at the incentives. So why is there so much, you know, environmental degradation? Well, one kind of, you know, classic economic answer is, look, each person has an incentive to, in the case of fishing, each fisherman has an incentive to overfish, but if we all overfish, then we're all worse off. But it's a kind of end person prisoner's dilemma here. Okay, so with the physical commons, you get, you know, if the incentives aren't aligned, then you get these problems, overfishing, over pollution, and so on. So I argue, well, what about the epistemic commons? What, you know, just as pollution can degrade the atmospheric commons, I think social pressure of a certain kind can degrade the epistemic commons. And by the way, this is kind of my take on the epistemic commons, but even if, you know, one doesn't agree with my arguments, I think it's still fruitful as a research program to think about, like, okay, well, we're all interconnected in this way. Epistemically, there's kind of a commons here. You know, what causes it to be degraded, or how can we improve it? As a kind of general question for research. And something like this idea is there in W.K. Clifford as well. So Clifford, famous for his essay called The Ethics of Belief, where he proposes that we have an ethical duty, not just an epistemic kind of duty, an ethical duty to believe only based on evidence. And his argument kind of builds on this idea that we're all interconnected, and our kind of epistemic resources are in some sense common property. And so what you believe is not just a private matter, it kind of bleeds into action and so on. And so we have a duty towards others to believe only based on sufficient evidence. So, and the interesting thing here is that he talks about common property. So he says, our lives are guided by that general conception of the course of things which has been created by society for social purposes. Our words, our phrases, our forms and processes and modes of thought are common property. So that's this idea from him, fashioned and perfected from age to age. So for Clifford, this means we have a duty to believe only based on proper evidence. So things like motivated reasoning are kind of, he calls it, you know, sins against humanity. My claim here is that we also have a duty to share our evidence as a means to maintaining this epistemic commons. And sometimes we have an incentive not to share our evidence, as in the case of Chernobyl. But even in democratic societies, there might be incentives not to share certain evidence. Okay, so here's a kind of formal example of this, and the issue is, if information is not shared, then even if all the individuals are epistemically rational, you can get a certain problem. Namely, even if each individual is epistemically rational, the group is epistemically irrational. So here's a way that here's an example that I explore a bit in the book about how this might come across. So suppose there's 3 engineers and there's a dam. Imagine this dam has a lot of people in this community are invested in the success of the dam. So all the politicians and the officials are very much invested in thinking this dam is going to succeed. Let's say so. For whatever reason, there's social pressures, incentives to kind of think the dam's gonna work out well. Okay, so consider the proposition the dam is gonna break this, and it's gonna be a disaster. So, sorry, consider the proposition that the dam is gonna stand. It's not gonna break. Okay, so there are a couple of reasons for thinking that. You might think, okay, well, R1, the dam is constructed with good materials, structural engineering is sound. So these are reasons to think dam is going to stand. Imagine all these reasons are equally weighty. So, but there are also reasons to think the dam's not going to stand. So these are R3, R4, and R5, and they're equally weighty. So if you take all this evidence together, it suggests the dam is going to break. Okay, but here's the issue. Say, because these are kind of the evidence that is incentivized. This evidence is going to be shared. This evidence is disincentivized. It's going to be divided across the 3 people. Okay, so engineer think A has R1, R2, R3. So she thinks, okay, well, 2 reasons stronger than the one countervailing reason, so dam is going to stand. Engineer B has R4, which is this piece of evidence. She thinks it's going to stand as well, and same with engineer C. So each engineer here is epistemically rational, but there is a sense in which the group is epistemically irrational. And this you can think is kind of a way to model what's going on with stuff like the Bay of Pigs or anywhere where there's a kind of group deliberating on something, but information is not shared. In a way, the group is irrational because look, if it looked at its total evidence, it should conclude that the dam's going to break and we should evacuate immediately. But okay, so you get this kind of situation, and the only way to solve this situation is to either each of the engineers should just be like, okay, this is going to be gonna invite some flack, but I'm gonna share it anyway. Or we should try to construct norms that people don't feel like they can't share this evidence. Okay, so I discussed this under the heading of social pressure, but we can use other headings. Basically, any social incentive not to share certain ideas or certain arguments, evidence. What this can happen, what this can lead to is causing reasons only on one side to pile up, and even if there are more reasons on the other side, they get systematically filtered out. And so the tragedy is, look, even if you have an individually rational epistemic agent, she looks at the total evidence presented to her, she forms a belief P, but the tragedy is that the evidence that's gone to her has gone through this filtering mechanism, and so you kind of get this problem. Okay, so there's this idea from Elizabeth Noel Newman, and she kind of gives a model of how this might occur. People are basically, so this is kind of going into how social pressure can lead people to self-censor. So she basically argues that, look, people are afraid of isolation. And by the way, Tocqueville has a lot of interesting things on this as well, and he makes similar points. But she kind of draws on Tocqueville to talk about this idea of isolation pressure. People basically don't want to be alone, and so when they perceive this isolation pressure, they're induced to self-censor. Process usually occurs with morally laden issues. So people are not going to self-censor about the weather. It's just not morally laden. Doesn't excite the passions. And over time, so even a minority can exert the pressure on a majority if it's coordinated enough, and then the majority is not coordinated. Over time, the silence opinion all but disappears. So suppose she's roughly right. The idea is like, look, given that we have a kind of epistemic commons in this way, we should be very mindful of the incentive structures that are getting the evidence to us. So we can think about, an epistemic supply chain, as it were, and the supply chain has to be properly structured as well. So, one point of the book is like it's not just a matter of like, there's a lot of work on biases and motivated reasoning. It's not just about all of us kind of being better able to catch our biases or motivated reasoning. If the supply chain that gets the information to us is filtering in a certain way, if the evidence that gets to us is not representative in some sense of the evidence out there, then then even if we're epistemically rational with respect to the evidence that does make its way to us, the view we settle on might be inaccurate or not represent reality. Okay, and so this is a kind of debunking argument. Working on a couple papers that try to make this argument further, but there's this idea that, look, spirals of silence are sensitive to social forces, not necessarily the truth. So if Noel Newman is roughly right, that is a kind of debunking argument for our beliefs. What are the chances that all the views settled in this way are going to be accurate? Okay, and this is a kind of reconstruction maybe of Mill's arguments in On Liberty, and he makes this striking claim about physics. And Mill's, On Liberty is, again, I think as much a essay on social epistemology as it is about free speech. Really what he's going at is like, what does it take for us to be justified? What does it take for us to know, given that, like, much of our evidence is given to us by others. We can't directly see everything. So he says here, even if the Newtonian philosophy were not permitted to be questioned, mankind could not feel as complete assurance of its truth as they now do. Beliefs which you have most warrant for have no safeguard to rest on, but a standing invitation to the whole world to prove them unfounded. Okay, so again, he is interested, I think, in the incentives. It's interesting that he picks Newtonian physics, because at the time, 1859, that was the kind of gold standard of physics. But he says even if that weren't able to be questioned, we should take it with a grain of salt. Okay, so this is relevant perhaps to current epistemic agencies or methods of knowledge production. You might think, these kind of hard sciences or areas of philosophy that don't really touch on any kind of the more abstract, such as metaethics or have the problem of mereology and metaphysics. It's not really morally or politically laden. Maybe these fields are kind of in much more they're much more kind of in line with this Millian spirit. I didn't. Yeah, sorry. So this slide I missed, but okay. So So if Mill is right, this idea is that look, you have a kind of defeater here. If you observe social pressure to avoid questioning P, that's a kind of defeater. It doesn't mean, I mean, it's a partial defeater. Need not be a full defeater. It undermines the justification we have for believing P. This is a kind of reinterpretation of Mill. One way of making this precise, and this is kind of drawing on Nathan Ballantyne's recent work, makes it likely that there's unpossessed evidence out there that would defeat our beliefs, but we don't have that evidence. So this is the Ballantyne calls this the problem of unpossessed evidence. But I think this problem of unpossessed evidence kind of helps us maybe offer a reconstruction of what Mill is doing in On Liberty as well. Okay, but perhaps more something that's maybe not as much in line with the Millian spirit. Some people worry about this. And Lowry is a kind of economist at Brown. He worries about social science in particular. I mean, I'm not sure I would put it as strongly as he puts it, but he says some areas of social science inquiry are so closely linked to the public mind, to sensitive issues, that an objective scholarly discussion of them is now impossible. And you can see how, if these kind of social pressures affect social sciences, then the stuff we get out, the evidence we get out, even if it is good evidence, might just be a partial subset of the total evidence. That then undermines the confidence we can have. He says the notion of objective research on this is from a paper from '94 that kind of first starts to look at some of these issues. Notion of objective research on the employment effects of the minimum wage, say, or the influence of maternal employment on child development can have no meaning if, when the results are reported, other scientists are mainly concerned to pose the ad hominem query, just what kind of economists, sociologists, and so on would say this. So Lowry's point is that people will interact strategically, so they will expect this to happen if they make certain arguments, and then as a result, they will not publish that stuff or make those arguments. And then, if this idea of unpossessed evidence, that will create a filtering process, right? So that'll mean you only get a subset at the end. And not a representative subset. I mean, we can never know everything, right? So all the evidence we have is a subset of the total evidence, strict subset maybe of total evidence. But if the subset is representative in some way, then we could be fine. So just an analogy with polling. So, what is the point of political polling? Well, you don't know, you can't, you can't know beforehand how every single person is going to vote, but if you get a kind of representative sample, you can be fairly confident, right? So if just to use the US example, if a pollster says, yeah, we did some polls, and then you say, okay, where did you do your polls from? Well, they're all from like rural Kentucky. Then you would say, well, okay, that poll doesn't tell me much because rural Kentucky is not representative of the whole country. Or likewise, if the pollster says, I got all my polling was done in Berkeley, California, then you say, okay, well, that doesn't tell me anything. I need to have a representative. It's fine if you poll only 2,000 people, but they should be kind of spread out across, weighted by population area and so on. Okay, so to the extent Lowry is right, and again, it's an open question how much that is there in social science. But suppose Lowry is right, then we settle on a distorted picture of the social world, which is both intrinsically bad because maybe knowledge is good, but also just like Chernobyl, if you don't know what the world is like, then the best. Even if you have good intentions, you can lead to bad policies. So what does this mean for individuals? Well, I think speaking our minds is a kind of collective action problem. So collective action problem is a situation where each of us has an incentive to defect, but if we all defect, then everyone is worse off. Classic case, environmental pollution. Each person has an incentive to pollute or to consume, travel a lot, etc. But if we all do that, then the global temperatures rise too much, and we're all worse off by that. Okay, now certain problems are soluble by property rights, but not the case of environment, because you can't really, it's not desirable nor feasible to have property rights over the atmosphere. But again, certain problems are soluble by property rights. But in this case, again, you can't really, this is like climate change. You can't really solve this by property rights. So, but that doesn't mean you can't solve it at all. So this is where social norms and morality, morality, part of its function, I guess, is to help us to solve these kind of dilemmas, social dilemmas, and social norms. That's how they function as well. So, okay, so on the morality side, I argue in the book that there's a kind of imperfect duty to reveal evidence, even when there's social pressure against doing so. Imperfect means like you don't have to, you don't have to speak your mind all the time. That would just take too much effort. And one classic case of imperfect duty is duty of beneficence. So duty of beneficence doesn't mean you have to donate to Oxfam or whatever. You can fulfill it in a range of ways. Okay, but it can't be too demanding either. So if you're living in North Korea or something, don't speak your mind, because that might get you sent to the camps or whatever. So it can't be that demanding, but it does make some demands. So it's duty to speak sometimes against social, as a means to help doing our part to preserve the epistemic commons. So just as we ought to do our part to preserve the environment, don't drive a gas guzzler when you can drive a more efficient vehicle. Likewise, we should do our part to preserve the epistemic commons as well. Okay, so and talk a bit about like how this applies to maybe research, publication, ethics. Maybe you can improve more on the stock of knowledge by defending understudied ideas, and this having a more potential to improve our collective understanding of the world. Other dimensions, so it's helping others speak their minds. Again, this is all, there's a broader, I think, a duty to help do our part to maintain the epistemic commons. And then, I think this is how I plug it into that duty, but different people can plug it in various different ways, even if they don't agree with my particular way of filling it in. Okay, one thing I want to talk about, this is a kind of commons problem, and one notorious issue with this is, do I make a difference, right? If I stop eating hamburgers, am I gonna save this polar bear? No, because the problem is so big that my individual action is unlikely to make any significant difference. So none of my climate actions are gonna save that polar bear. And so you might think, well, it's not really, we shouldn't think about it from an individual perspective. You just have to think about it from some kind of broader perspective. I want to push back a little bit on this by saying, look, individuals can have impact, and this is, the classic ASCH experiments, I think, suggest that individuals can have impact. So just, many people will be familiar with this, but just in case someone isn't, there's this idea that, look, people were asked this very simple question. look at this line, which of these three lines is the same height as this line? And the answer is meant to be very simple. It's C. So it's not meant to be a challenging problem. It's perceptually evident. So it's not, doesn't require like difficult calculations. But the setup was, let's see what happens if, so there's one subject here, there's 6 of them are actors and there's one subject. We say start from over here, say, okay, what's the answer? The first person gives the wrong answer, says B, and the second person says B, 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 and then the core experiment is like, let's see what this last person says. This is from the 50s, so that's, you know, that explains maybe the demographic composition. These are college students in Swarthmore in the 50s. But okay, so okay, and about 40% of people went with the wrong answer. So basically conformed with the, so it's a experiment of conformity. Do people conform? And 40% conformed, 60% didn't. So that means a good chunk. And 40% is interesting because look, it's meant to be very easy. And so then there's a change in the design where one other actor gives the right answer. So then the question is like, does one other person make much of a difference on you? And the error rate falls by 4. So basically, if we take the lesson here from the experiment is, it's something like, look, even if you have one other person saying it like you think, you feel much more okay dissenting from the majority. Okay, that, you know, also talk about on pluralistic ignorance here, but I'll just, in interest of time, move on. You might also think like, look, I mean, one issue with kind of speaking your mind is like, especially on latent issues, people are very entrenched. A lot of affective polarization and broadly across the world, really, but certainly across the Western world right now. I think, look, you can't really. People think what they think. You can't really change anything. But look, I mean, there might be somebody that you aren't aware of that is listening to your conversation, and they might learn something from it, even if they don't change their minds. But okay, so this idea of speaking your mind, one might think, okay, surely this is too broad, because what about trolls, internet trolls, and so on? They're just saying stuff to rile people up. What about just pure contrarianism, like just, you know, I just want to be special, so I'll say the opposite thing to what everybody else is saying. Okay, but these or you know, grandstanding. My colleague here has a book called Grandstanding, where the idea is people might say something in order to get kind of positive feedback from their community, rather than because they want to improve the epistemic commons, in my words. But I think I can successfully bracket these things out, because by speaking your mind, I really mean like sharing your evidence. So it's not just like hurling insults or being an internet troll or something like that. Okay, so just to wrap up soon here, but so that's the epistemic commons part of the book. I have a couple chapters on speaking your mind for its own sake, and kind of drawing on Aristotle here so Aristotle plus, so I think Aristotle's view plus some important results in modern social psychology, cognitive science can yield that we should kind of speak our mind. So here's the argument. So Aristotle's view is that, look, if you want to know what an excellent member of a particular kind is, or what a flourishing they're ultimately interested in flourishing human lives. They say, okay, excellent member of any kind. You have to know what its ergon or function is. Um, okay, so you want to know what a good knife is, then you need to know what a knife is for, which is for cutting, and then you say, okay, well, a good knife is one that has a sharp blade and a good handle. But that's not the same thing as a good shoe. If a shoe has a sharp blade, that's like a bad shoe because its function is something else. Okay, so back to human lives. Well, what is so if we want to say what a eudaimonia or human flourishing is, well, we need to know what the human ergon is or characteristic work, and the argument goes like, look, it can't be digestion because even cats can digest. That's not something special to us. It can't be growth because trees can grow. Okay, what is special about human beings is their rational capacities, and he kind of understands it a bit broadly from what we might mean by rational now. But okay, so suppose he's right. What can we draw from this? Well, there's a lot of, Shauna Schifrin has an excellent book on this where she talks about the outward expression as being essential to thinking. And, as academics are very kind of familiar with this idea that, look, writing is thinking, right? So you can't, to produce a good philosophy, you got to write rather than just kind of sit down and think by yourself. So, okay, outward expression essential to thinking. It's not like thinking happens and then you outward express. It's like outward expression is kind of, you might say, constitutive of the thinking process. Mercier and Sperber have this interesting book where they say reason is essentially interactive. So reasoning is meant to be done with others. So it's like a tennis game rather than a game of climbing a mountain. It's really, you can't play you can play tennis against a wall, but there's limitations. You need somebody else to play with. So if reason is essentially interactive, and if Aristotle's broadly right that our rational capacities are important, at least to our flourishing, then we get this idea that like we ought to express, outward expression then is going to be key to developing these capacities. That's one strand. Another strand I try to explore in the book, and this is something that I think Mill and Nietzsche both, they of course have very different kind of commitments on other things, but here's somewhere where they really agree and say very similar things. So the similarity is quite interesting. So Mill says human nature resembles a tree. This is on Liberty, chapter 3, not a machine. So in order to flourish, we have to be independent in some way, and of course Nietzsche would say if you just follow the herd, you can't be. For him, it's precondition of a great life. Of course, Nietzsche has idiosyncratic views about the great life, and he's very he thinks only few people can do it. But I think Mill is much more, you might say, egalitarian than Nietzsche is. But anyway, there's this common idea. Look, we take a broader conception of what the good life is. Of course, these things like wealth and status and so on are important. Not downplaying those, but they're not everything. And so, I argue that if you take a broader conception of the good life, maybe we ought to express ourselves even if there are some monetary or status costs. Okay, so back to this idea of a epistemic commons. This is the final kind of chapter, so I'll wrap up soon. But look, again, this is a kind of meta issue because in order to make good decisions, we need to know what the world is like. And human flourishing in the future, I mean, even if you're not like full on like long-termist, Will McCaskill or whatever, I think it's plausible that we have like significant, you might say, obligations to the future generations. And this is commonly accepted with regard to the very important issues of climate change and AI risk and others. But again, this meta problem, we need to know, make good decisions. We need to mitigate our blind spots. And it's interesting, Mill has this kind of inductive argument. He says, well, look at any generation in the past. It has its own blind spots. What are the chances we don't have any now? Okay, so plausibly we have some blind spots. And in order to mitigate them, the only kind of solution is for people to speak their minds and promote norms of free inquiry and discussion. Because if you don't have that, then a blind spot is more or less inevitable, I think. Okay, so that you might think, okay, well, that's an obligation to the future. What if I don't care about the future or something like that? Well, I think we all kind of care about the future because, and I think, well, actually, some people don't get this intuition, so maybe not all of us. But okay, I certainly get this intuition. This is from Scheffler, as a very excellent book, Death and the Afterlife, and brought out in this movie, The Children of Men, which is also very entertaining and interesting. So basically, the premise is everybody's gone infertile, so there are no more kids. What happens to in my view, I think, like, if tomorrow everybody stopped having kids, I would be gripped by nihilism. It'd be like, okay, what's the point? Why am I writing anything? What's, etc. And that's what happens in this movie. So it's a kind of dystopia. And okay, so if that's right, and Scheffler picks up on this, saying, like, look, the future of humanity is part of what gives our lives meaning. It's not so much like we're doing things like, okay, well, it's not merely like, okay, well, I'm gonna try to cure cancer so that people in the future are happy. There is that, but I think it goes deeper. It's like we want to be part of this story or whatever. And so if we're the final chapter, it's kind of depressing. Okay, but and perhaps nihilism inducing. I want to claim, I mean, Scheffler says, okay, we want future people to exist. I would say not just exist, but flourish. We don't want just like people existing, I mean, imagine everything becomes like, whatever, take your dystopia, 1984. It's like 1984 from here on out. I think that's still kind of depressing too. It's not just that even though humans exist, we want humans to flourish. The reason 1984 is depressing is because people are not really flourishing in that regime, or whatever else. Pick your favorite dystopia. Okay, so then just to conclude, this idea that, look, we ought to speak our minds in the sense of revealing evidence, not just trolling. Essential to avoiding major cultural blind spots, and it's an ethical duty, but also, I think, kind of required to preserve what gives our lives meaning here and now. Okay, so that's it. Thanks for listening, and look forward to any feedback or questions. And so, I mean, this mostly based on this book, but I'm currently trying to publish parts of certain ideas from the book into journal articles as well. So any feedback is helpful going forward as well. So thank you.